Hello, Brad here, just to say we're super proud that the Friday 5pm podcast is sponsored by the Malt Miller, the UK's best home brew store.
We use the Malt Miller for all of our homebrew experiments, as well as tapping them up for advice and binging on their awesome YouTube channel all the time.
That's why whenever we release a homebrew video, we put a recipe kit live on the Malt Miller, so you can brew with the exact same amazing ingredients that we did. The same ingredients used by pro brewers.
So alongside the Malt Miller's nitro-flushed hops, cold-stored yeast and milled-to-order malts, you can pick up recipe kits for our 5 Points Best Bitter, Russian River West Coast IPA, and now the fastest beer in the world, a hazy session IPA that goes from grain to glass in less than 48 hours.
Sign up to their newsletter at tinyurl.com/Malt Miller to get 5% off your first order. With the Malt Miller's amazing customer service and Johnny's 48-hour recipe, you could order the ingredients on a Monday and be drinking the beer by the weekend.
Speaking of which, it's Friday.
It's 5pm.
So enjoy this week's Friday 5pm podcast. It's Friday, it's 5pm, and I hope you've got a drink in your hand because we will be celebrating this week with a special guest spot from one of my favourite beer writers and indeed old friends, Mark Dredge. He'll be joining us in a little bit after I do our normal spiel. The first thing is to say that in about 24 hours' time, I will be going live on our YouTube channel for a solo live show based around the book. So hopefully by then, lots of you will have received your book. You'll have some questions that you might want to ask. You might have some views about some of the history. We'll dig into some views that people have had this week as well about the book. And I want you to bring those to that live show. I'd love to answer some questions. I'd love to talk around some of the topics. Lots of you have been emailing me with stuff that you sort of hope was in the book or that you thought was missing or stuff like that. So I'd love to hear more of that in a sort of an open forum where we can talk about all of this. And of course, we'll be trialing my new segment, my new idea for live shows, which is Drink Johnny Dry, in which you will get to guide which beers I'm opening from my stash in a desperate bid to bring it down from just over 400 beers, I've now counted, down to something that will actually fit in a fridge. So that's the aim for 2025, and we'll see if that format works tomorrow night at 8 p.m. This has been a really busy week for me. Bradley's still sunning himself in LA or San Francisco. I forget where he is at this point, but I've been doing lots of podcasts to promote the book. I was on The Moon Underwater, which is an amazing podcast, one I've loved for a long time, and was amazed when my friend Robbie Knox, who I've known for a couple of years now, got the gig as the new host. So as soon as I knew the book launch date, I messaged him and said, please let me be on. And he very graciously allowed me. So I was filming that actually last night in Clerkenwell, and then went for a couple of pints afterwards. But there's actually 2 episodes of The Moon Underwater. So I've got a main episode, and then we'll be doing a pub notice board episode in which I gave Robbie and his co-host Dan a heady topper and a focal banger to try. They had no idea what these beers were, but they definitely do now because they absolutely love them. So there's a lot of joy in that podcast as they try some of the best IPAs in the world. And then yesterday I also recorded a segment with Something You Should Know, which is Mike Crothers, sort of a broadcaster, radio broadcaster in the US, who has a podcast where he picks topics and interesting stories that he thinks people should know. And he talks about them with the people that know it best. So I was talking quite a lot about the history of beer, where we think it came from, the origins, the people that were involved, and how it's developed in the last sort of 11 to 13,000 years and the effect that it's had on society. So sort of a brief flick through the book, essentially, but with some real focus on ancient societies, which I haven't really dug into in the other promo that I've been doing. So it was great to do that. So yeah, that is all the news. Do join me tomorrow at 8 p.m. It should be a lot of fun. And otherwise, we have, you've been listening to me talk a lot with this podcast and indeed the recent episodes because Brad's been away. But next week, we are talking about how Guinness has changed the world on the channel. And that will, of course, involve not only splitting the G, but also getting Brad's views on the incredible work of Mr. G himself, not Mr. Guinness, but Mr. Gilroy, who did many of the iconic adverts for Guinness back in the middle of the 20th century. And obviously with his design now, there's some really interesting things that he talks about. So that's next week's video. But back to this podcast. So I did a lot of research for The Meaning of Beer, read a huge amount of books, and about half of them were donated by Mark, who I've known for about 10 years. We'll talk about me and Mark's origin story because there's quite a hilarious early video of the craft beer channel that Mark features in. But his book, A Brief History of Lager, was one of the formative texts that I used for the book, and in fact one of the ones that inspired it, because it was actually in A Brief History of Lager that I learned about the first fridge being built at Spartan Brewery. So we can credit Mark with the thing that inspired me to write this new book. And now I'll let him speak. How are we doing, Mark?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I think I'm honored to come on and chat about, well, your book, because I'm really excited to read it.
Well, let's start with your book. I think would be fair. Tell me about, because everybody knows where the meaning of beer came from now. Tell me where A Brief History of Lager came from.
I think, as someone who just loves beer in general, I certainly, when we came into beer, lager was not the thing you talked about. Lager wasn't particularly interesting. Lager was mainstream brands. And so my whole formative journey through beer was never interested in lager at all. It was, hey, what's the newest cask ale? Hey, what's the most exciting weird beer I can find in Belgium? And it kind of progressed like that. Yeah. And I even remember on the first time I went to the Czech Republic, I was like, I don't know where I'm going because I don't even like lager. What's the point? And as soon as you get there, you have one glass of fresh pills, and you're like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yeah,
my life has changed. This is there's a really clear demarcation in my life now of Mark before lager and Mark after lager. And I'm not entirely sure where the first idea came to tell this story of lager. But I just noted that there was no history of it. And if 95% of all beer drunk in the world is lager, it just baffled me that story had not yet been told. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as that got in my head, I was like, well, I have to be the one that writes this now, because I can't let anyone else do it, because I've got the idea.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very much that. It was very much, I don't know the full history of this. I don't know the full significance of this drink. Certainly not sort of where it came from, but I do know the real significance of it today, in that you walk into any bar anywhere in the world and say beer, you will ultimately or essentially get a cold fizzy yellow beer, which is a lager. And I kind of wanted to understand how we came to that point.
Yeah, I mean, when I first heard that you were writing that book, 'cause is it your fifth, maybe even sixth book?
Yes. I think it was number 6.
Yeah, like I was pretty naive. What would it have been? About 2018. We went for a walk around Clissold Park, and we were talking about what books we were hoping to work on and stuff. And I think you just started working on it. And I don't know. I naively kind of couldn't quite see past like the Pilsner Urquell story. I was like, what else is there that's fascinating to tell? And it turns out that it's one of the most significant, most significant food products that's ever been developed. But like you say, there were no references that really, or maybe lots of references that talked about it, but nobody that pulled it all together. And that was what I thought was so incredible about Brief History of Lager was, and something that I tried to do with The Meaning of Beer is to say, the impact of Budweiser on American advertising and American sport, as well as, the origin story of lager, of pale lager, and the reason why perhaps lager yeasts are in this particular part of Europe and stuff like that. Like, it's a very interdisciplinary book, which I think The Meaning of Beer has been too, and that's been reflected in some of the reviews going out. I'm not quite sure what this book is. It's a bit of everything.
For me, I didn't go into writing the lager book with all of that stuff in mind. Like, I didn't sit down before and think, oh, okay, well, almost like where Meaning of Beer has come out as, to kind of telling a human history of beer, a human history or technological history with beer as kind of its central point. I didn't have that idea. I was just like, well, what are all the stages? What's the timeline of lager? And the more I looked into it, the more I realized how important things like refrigeration were, and mass production and bottling and transportation. Like, these were all things that I'd maybe picked up through just understanding and knowing and caring about beer's history, but hadn't made those actual connections. And so the more and more I read and wrote for that book, the more important it made lager seem as a drink in general. It's not just well, it's just beer, but it's completely changed so many of the things about the world, which is why when I saw your book, I was like, oh shit, he's written the book that I want to write. But I didn't realize I wanted to write it at the time. It's just one of those ones. It's like, yeah, of course, this is the next, this ties everything up together, which tells us why beer actually is the most important drink in the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you agree with that, and that you see that was sort of the inspiration of it. But it was I do very much in some ways see the meaning of beer as like the next logical step on from a brief history of lager, and huge amounts of the history that I tell is quite similar stories to yours. And the book is literally listed in, it seems to have ended up in food and drink, but it's actually a travel book really. And we went on lots of similar journeys. So the Reinheitsgebot, that you've been to Schloss Kaltenberg. And it was you that put me in touch with the archivist at Budweiser as well. Can you describe, well, I guess both those trips, but we'll start with Budweiser, because I think, as exciting as that trip to Castle Kaltenberg was, the impact of that particular document is well documented. But Budweiser, I feel like beer geeks in particular have dismissed that brand for a long time, but you can't dismiss the impact that it's had on the world previous to craft.
It's such an impressive place to go. That I still say, if someone says to me, what's the kind of best or most interesting brewery tour you've ever been on, I would still almost always talk about the St. Louis Budweiser brewery.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly the most handsome brewery. When you walk into that old, 1890s, that brew house was built.
Yep.
It is spectacular. It's incredible. And you walk in there and it's like, you see Budweiser as this enormous global brand, which is made around the world. But there is still this sort of incredible beauty to that, to that 1890s brew house, which is still remains and is still in use today. But being there and seeing that and kind of connecting the history of St. Louis together, in my head, I was trying to picture. I had this great map from above of where all the breweries were and where all the cellars were. And I was just trying to picture, like, what would this place have actually been like in the 1870s, sort of as Budweiser was becoming a bigger brand and as St. Louis was becoming this enormous lager center. I was just trying to imagine, how did they have so many underground areas where they were storing this beer? What were their beer gardens like? How did this place smell? How did it look? How did it feel? And I think because the campus at Budweiser is so large, it's one of the few places in the world you can almost go to understand what kind of truly industrial brewing is like in a relatively small town.
Yeah, absolutely. That was what really sort of hit home. And it's a similar feeling when I visited Guinness as well. It was the first time where I sort of physically seen just how important brewing was in the mid 1800s, how it would have been. Yeah, and even up into the 90s when Budweiser sold, it feels like it was an incredibly, huge employer for the town, a huge cultural sort of statement on the landscape as well. And I was chatting to, had a great tour with a guy called Troika who sort of showed me around some of the craft breweries and dug into the history. I got chatting to him, and there was a brewery that's in the old Lemp brewery now, and I got to go down to the old Lemp cellars, which was kind of mad. And they were talking to me about how they were super proud of Budweiser in St. Louis. Like when it was the Super Bowl, and they'd be like, I can't wait to see what the Budweiser advert's going to be, and it's all, inspired by our town and our brewery. And that when Budweiser sold, it was, as heartbreaking as, say, when Camden did for a lot of people. It was like, that was our town brewery. And, obviously the scale of it was off the charts, but it still felt like, the almost the soul of St. Louis to some extent.
Yeah, when something has been central to a city for more than a century, I guess you do have that feel into it. Camden was 5 years old when it sold. Budweiser was much older than that.
Yeah,
it's generational, like kind of the significance of that site, and just of St. Louis as a city for lager. For so long that was an epicenter of brewing, and of brewing on scale. You talk about Lemp. Lemp was enormous. It's one of those great brands that, and there are so many of these, one of those great brands that was absolutely massive, but just doesn't exist now.
Yeah. Yeah, just has almost been written out of history as well. You know, you really have to go to the primary source to hear proper
Hmm.
conversations about it, and the context that Lemp had, like even possibly being the original lager, like sort of contested between that and is it something in Philadelphia
Hmm.
for the first American lager.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll ever uncover that origin story of kind of first American lager. It's going to be, I think it's going to be too lost in history now and lost in process and place. And yeah, who knows?
Yeah, I think so. And I guess the historical record, you know, it will be a very different problem for historians in 100 years as they look to unpick sort of the craft beer movement, because there'll be too much information, too much contradiction. Whereas I think with the origins of lager in America, there's just not enough primary sources to know for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. The other thing that really struck me when I was going around, because like you say, it's, you know, the most beautiful campus. And that was, I think, clearly, obviously, it's a conscious choice by the brewery, but I think a conscious choice as German immigrants to sort of say, you know, we're very much here to stay. We're proud of our German heritage, but equally, we're embracing what, you know, people who have been there for hundreds of years would consider, you know, makes America great. So it's sort of it was a real statement that they went for by building a campus that stunning. And what kind of upset me to some extent is when I went to Burton-on-Trent recently, and I did a hike around there to gather some B-roll for the Cask Ale series that we're working on. And you go around and you look at the old maps of what used to be there, and all of it is gone. All of it has been torn down. There's the old Bass pumping station for the well for the water, and it is derelict. You know, it looks like something out of a Armageddon movie set. It's just like all overgrown and windows broken, and you know, it's super disheartening that that's what we've done with a lot of our brewing heritage. Whereas America, I guess by maybe resisting, you know, they didn't have quite the same sort of consolidation that we did in the 60s or whatever it was that did so much damage. Hey Beer Geeks, Johnny here. Just in case I haven't mentioned it enough on the podcast, approached you in the street, or accosted you in your own home, I thought I'd make a quick advert about my new book, The Meaning of Beer. This travel book follows me on a 3-year adventure around the world to discover the surprising ways in which beer has helped build and shape the world. From inspiring the pyramids to funding monasticism, from inventing the fridge to changing modern medicine, and from lubricating the Nazi Party's first meeting to potentially solving climate change, with lots more in between. It's already been called enlightening by the amazing Ollie Smith, and one of the most important books ever written about beer by fellow beer writer Mark Dredge, and it's available for pre-order now in hardback, ebook and audiobook for its release on the 7th of November 2024. Now back to the pod.
Yeah, fascinating. My girlfriend's from Burton. We've been together almost 10 years. So I go to Burton all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like a ghost town in a way, and it is really sad. And there's kind of relics of beer at every corner, you know.
Yep.
Mostly because there's a pub on every corner, but you know, it's more than that. And it's such a sad thing when you know the incredible history of Burton and just how much beer was made there, to know that almost none of that exists now. I mean, it's still probably certainly one of the top 3 biggest breweries in the UK, but it just somehow doesn't feel as significant.
No, I mean, there's not a lot of cultural significance to Madry, or at least I hope there won't be. Like, it's if we could pick one brand that the historians will be writing about for this era of brewing, I really, really hope it's not going to be Madry.
Yeah, what would it be? What?
Well, it's a great question.
Punk IPA probably.
I'd imagine, I'd imagine so. You know, we'll have to see what they do with that legacy, and you know how long it lasts, because obviously Brewdog's in this it's financially stricken really with the fact that it hasn't been able to float. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, or if somebody else will come and I guess supplant themselves. I'm sure there's breweries that would have those ambitions, people like Northern Monk and Vocation, that could become sort of the new big independent brewery. But yeah, it probably would be Punk from where we're sat right now. And there'll be endless historical references to the days where the ABV went down and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
as it slowly watered itself into ignominy. Yeah, so that was one of the really surprising chapters in your book, and one that I was really keen to sort of, I was adding. My story was about German immigrants really when I went to St. Louis, but it was very much inspired by your chapter. And the other one was obviously the Reinheitsgebot. And I think I've spent the last 3 years writing this book, and spent the last 3 years just digging into histories of Central Europe that I never thought that I would, like the 30 Years War, the rise of Hitler. There's the fact that Hefeweizen might possibly come from Bohemia, all these kind of mad rabbit holes that I've ended up down. I've even accused a certain Duke Maximilian of murder, which I don't think the Wittelsbachs are going to come for me for, but you never know. How did you sort of discover that you could see the original Reinheitsgebot, and what were the big revelations you had out there?
Well, I didn't even know that was going to be possible. So for me, that was just a big surprise. I just
you lined up the interview without knowing that it was possible.
Yeah. So I don't know what it was. The book kind of opens with me saying, "Oh, I found the person I need to speak to," and that is really sort of what actually happened. I was like, oh, "Okay, there's still a member of the Bavarian royal family. There is this person who is the great whatever grandfather of, or grandson of the person that started Oktoberfest." Like, all of these things came together. So I just sent a message, like, really hopefully, "Hey, I would like to talk to you about your family and about beer." Mm-hmm. And I got a message back almost immediately. He was like, "Sure, come on this date and I'll meet you." And then when I was there, it was during, I can't remember what it's called, but they basically put on this great big, was it? I can't remember what it's called.
Like the medieval festival, was it?
Yeah, it's like a medieval
festival.
festival.
It was. Right.
And they put on so the center of this medieval festival is this jousting show.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine, we know what wrestling is like. Imagine like a jousting version of wrestling. So you kind of know there's a narrative to it. It's probably pre-organized who's going to win, all of that stuff. But it's huge and it's amazing. But anyway, I didn't have any idea again that I was going in the middle of this enormous festival. But I met him and he's like, "Come up to my office and we can talk." And he just goes in and he just pulls out the Reinheitsgebot, which I'm just standing there like, "Oh, okay, this is the coolest thing I think I've ever seen. This is the most important thing I think I've ever seen, and the most important thing I need for this book." So that is, very nice, nice surprise.
Because obviously I knew that it was coming because I'd read your book, but I was still surprised when he brought it out and it was sort of in this grubby grey, sort of cheap binding that looked something out of W.H. Smith's, but the actual printing of it is just incredible. And I think he said he found it in like a church archive or something. It wasn't even his originally. And it's just another remarkable example of, one nation caring for its heritage. And maybe the Brits aren't so good at that.
Yeah. Well, the thing that fascinated me about it, and again, this was something which I didn't realize before, is that it's just one rule in a book of hundreds of rules. We hear that the Reinheitsgebot, as a beer geek, you hear of this Reinheitsgebot as this crazy, amazing purity law, and you almost think of it as this kind of singular decree that was made by the king 500 years ago for whatever reasons. But it's not. It was simply a change of leadership or a change of king, I suppose.
Yes, unification, wasn't it, of two parts of Bavaria that led to a single ruler. Yeah,
exactly. So each of those maybe 5 different kind of areas were brought together. If you're going to do that, you need rules that cover all of them. There were already several beer purity laws, if you like, air quotes. And it just collected it together, and as one rule out of hundreds, it was just in that book.
Yeah, it was wild to see, because obviously we think of, and what if you do a Google image search for Reinheitsgebot, it's like these big posters. But like Prince Leopold said, like that was just made so that breweries could have one and brag about the fact that they brewed to the Reinheitsgebot. It's quite a modern invention. Like, it was a pretty dry book of tax rules and import laws and all this kind of stuff that, when they wrote it, they must have not thought that they were doing anything of real significance other than telling people how much tax to pay. and yet 500 years later, there's you and me making pilgrimages to just to see it, just to touch it.
What losers?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, as I was saying that, I was like, man, I hope everyone at home is finding this exciting. Otherwise, just two very, very sad men. But yeah, I mean that I've decided, like, from my trips there, I did 2 for the book. That just that history of that, because it's quite a fraught part of Europe politically for a long, long time. Obviously, with like World War II, of course, but even before that, it's sort of caught in the crosswinds of all the different empires that rose and fell. And Bavaria seems relatively immune to it, given that they had the prince was saying it's the longest dynasty in history. He's claiming of 900 years, but you can't talk about the beer without digging into that kind of history. Like the fact that the city of Munich was spared during the 30 Years' War. So they sort of bribed the Swedish, what's his name? I think it was Adolf, wasn't it? King Adolf, the Swedish guy who sort of sacked his way all the way down to Munich and then went, "Oh, just have the beer, don't worry." And it just, beer has this incredible significance that, perhaps it doesn't have today, but historically it's always kind of had. And you just can't escape it in Bohemia and Bavaria.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And for me, I wanted to sort of tell a social history. That was kind of how I was coming into it. So I was coming in almost looking for old newspaper articles and looking for these old descriptions of what it was actually like. So, like, connecting up these bits of history, of war and stuff, and it's kind of these great big stories that overarch history or like pinpoint certain moments. But I was really fascinated about that day-to-day experience, because I think that's the thing which resonates with us today. If we can say, we know what it's like to go to the pub and drink a pint of nice, fresh, kegged, hazy IPA. But what was that? What was the equivalent of that in Bavaria 500 years ago, 300 years ago? And I was always trying to almost find those kind of reports, I suppose, to kind of understand what it was like.
Yeah, and there are some great nuggets in that book that, like, some of them I quote in The Meaning of Beer. Like, I'm fairly sure it was you that sort of, you had that report from the first pouring of Pilsner Urquell and somebody describing it in sort of these reverent, hushed tones that were really sort of resonant, I think, because it's it's what we all do when we get a new beer that's crystal clear and we hold it up to the light and go, "Whoa, look at that!" And they were doing that 200 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's not necessarily a new thing. People have been kind of talking about the beauty of beer for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Another part of your book that I loved and I sort of dig even further into the wider impacts of the same story is Carlsberg, and the incredible impact that laboratory had. Did you do a full sort of visit and tour of Carlsberg when you were researching for that section?
Yeah, I spent a couple of days over at Carlsberg. Again, it's a similar thing. I think when you're researching a book, you go in with ideas about what you want to capture from it. But I think it's always great if you come away with so much more, and you come away with so many more angles and so much more depth than you expected. But yeah, I spent a couple of days over there just trying to really comprehend the significance of Carlsberg. Like the section in the book that almost a central section for me in the lager book it's called the Grandfathers of Lager. So it's pulling together, for me, the 4 perhaps most important breweries, and Carlsberg was always the end of that. So the beginning of that was Pilsner Urquell, maybe Hofbrau. Is it Hofbrau House? I don't know. Hofbrau House are in there. Maybe they're before that. But it's sort of that, as lagers began to modernize, kind of who are the founding fathers almost of that movement. And Carlsberg were there essentially throughout that, but they were the ones who almost put the full stop on the end of that era of brewing. Kind of everything that they did at the end of their not at the end, everything that they did sort of up to the 1880s or so kind of completely transformed and changed not just lager but all beer everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of how I read it. Like, that story sort of starts obviously with, I guess, Sabelmar and Dreher with the Märzen, and Vienna Lager, and then Pilsner Urquell come in, and then essentially what Carlsberg do is come in and make it possible for everybody else to do the same, I guess, by managing to isolate yeast. And obviously with other things like the pH meter, which was invented at that laboratory as well. And that was actually the topic of this week's video. So last week we talked about Louis Pasteur's huge impact on brewing and on winemaking and vodka making. And then this week's video was all about how essentially the technologies and knowledge and processes that he put together were then taken by Emil Christian Hansen at Carlsberg. And then he made his further discovery by sort of saying to Pasteur, like, my beer's sick, but I don't think it's bacteria. Maybe we should consider the fact that yeasts are all very different and do very different things, which I never quite entirely untangled in my head, because I feel like breweries must have known this before, that there must have been different strains of yeast. But, you know, do you think it was that Emil was the first person that said, and we can separate them by knowing they look different? Or was he the first person that worked out how we could separate them? What was your take on that?
Do you know what? I genuinely don't know the answer, because it's easy to look back with modern knowledge, isn't it? And think, well, obviously it's this. Obviously the yeasts are different. But when you don't really have high technology microscopes or DNA sequencing or any of that stuff, maybe it's a lot harder. All you know is behavioral traits. You know, if it's behaving different and it tastes different, then something has changed. But without knowing what that change is, you've got so many variables. So yeah, I think it's a really difficult one. For me, though, I've kind of argued in lots of different things that Emil Christian Hansen's isolation of yeast is the most important thing that's ever happened in beer, because it just enabled consistency everywhere. You know, it enabled you to finally have control over brewing, or at least you could control the thing which was the hardest to control.
Yeah.
And so I think that discovery is so fundamental to the history of beer. It almost doesn't matter what was happening before it in many ways, you know, because we got to this point where we could completely then understand it and control it. But then what you do see is that it becomes almost a bottleneck of change in a way. You know, you've got the 1800s, because we know a bit more about it. It's this great century where you've got so many, and almost everywhere has a local beer, and there's so much variety to that. But then as soon as you get to this point where you can control the yeast, going via the lens of everything else that happened in that century, you know, pasteurization and artificial refrigeration and all of that stuff, beer completely changed, and it really narrowed the variety that we had. So when you go into the 1800s, I mean, I wouldn't be able to catalog world beer, but if you go into 1900, it would be much easier to sort of say this is what beer looks like in 1900. Completely changed everything that happened in beer.
Yeah, it's not quite an Oppenheimer moment, like regretting what you've invented, but it definitely had a very negative impact as well as a very positive one. And I think in the UK, we slightly forget that, because we did manage to maintain a semblance of diversity within beer right up until sort of the 1960s, really. But in Europe, it must have been, you know, an absolute tidal wave of beers just going pale and crispy and mostly clear and tasting presumably quite a lot like Carlsberg.
Yeah, and it's hard to say that that's a good thing. But, I don't know. It fascinates me. Like and this is a question I was thinking earlier, and I've thought this many times over the years. Like, if I could travel back to any point in time to taste beer, where would I go? Like, if I was allowed one push on a time travel button and a couple of pints, what button am I pushing? And so much of me wants to actually go to like late 1800s in St. Louis and try Budweiser, or early 1900s in Munich. Sort of this shift between, or this tension between dark lager and pale lager. Like, what was that like? Because we can read reports and, you know, we're trying to tell these history stories, but it's really hard to know actually what it was like. All we've got is this sort of this bigger picture lens that has been shone down upon it. Like if we tell the history of craft beer, or if someone in 100 years is telling the history of craft beer in 2020, they might assume that every beer drunk is Madry and Punk IPA.
Yeah.
And, yes, which is kind of representative, but then there's so much more to it than that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you said that, it's a great question. Like, if you could teleport yourself back into any moment in beer, what would it be? And then almost immediately I was like, I'd like to have been on the square in Pilsen to see if they really did tip those barrels out. But B, to have been there a couple of years later and to sample that, that original Pilsner Urquell and see how close it is to what we consider Czech lager today. But actually, yeah, maybe I'd want to go a little bit later once pale lager's had a bit more time to see exactly, as you say, like that tension, like just how complete was that tidal wave, how much changed, how much was lost. And to be able to, to be in somewhere like Munich where that tension would have been most evident, and that would have led, I guess, to the invention of the Helles by Spaten in, I think it's 1889, maybe, because that must have been, I guess, to some extent, them sort of admitting some kind of defeat to some extent, in that they were like, no, we have to make beer exactly like the Czechs are doing if we want to compete, which was a reversal, obviously, of how it had been for a long time.
Yeah, and that's kind of the story that we hear, isn't it? It's that there was this rejection of pale beer in Munich for a long time, like 50 years or more. They said no, that as far as we know, our beer, the Bavarian beer, is brown, it's dark beer.
Yep.
Don't do pale beer.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this great long rejection of it. And presumably it was a consumer sort of taste that changed that as much as anything. Yeah, it's fascinating how we can tell the story of this spread of pale lager, because by very, very quickly as pale lager spread, as lager spread, it was pale lager that spread a bit further and a bit faster.
Mm-hmm.
But yet Bavarians stayed true to that older style. And even now, if you drink in around Franconia and just have a normal lager beer, it's still on the darker side. It's not sparkling, yellow.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more amber in color.
Yep. Yeah, so that is sort of a little bastion that sort of held on to that traditional Metzen, almost, well, even darker than Metzen, isn't really? It's full on amber.
Yeah, exactly. It's just this lovely heritage that remains, almost like Zeugl. Did you go to Zeugl, or have you been to Zeugl?
No, so if there's two places I want to go in the three places I want to go in the craft beer world that I haven't been yet, and it's Cologne and it's Bamberg. I haven't been to either yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure how it's got this far. And we did actually we had a trip planned that was cancelled by COVID to go to Bamberg. So I should have done it in 2020, but it didn't come together.
Oh man, you've got to go. I've probably drunk in Bamberg more than I've drunk in, well, certainly in any other UK city. I've just happened to travel there a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an interesting place. I think it's the most interesting place to drink kind of classic German lagers, purely because you can have like a full variety.
Yeah.
If you drink in Czech Republic, you can have a great variety of kind of 10 degree and 12 degree pale lagers and maybe a 14 degree dark lager.
Mm-hmm.
If you drink in Munich, obviously you get some pale, you get some dark. But if you drink in Bamberg, you've got so much more variety than that. You've got Helles, you've got Pilsner, you've got these kind of more unique local styles. You've got brown lagers, black lagers. I think you just have a much greater spread of it.
Is Root beer, is that Franconian as well, or is that from somewhere else? I can't remember now.
Which one was that?
So Root beer.
I mean, you don't see that much of it there, but I think it does have some kind of connection. But it's not one you typically see. You see more of these like amber color, but then they're not called amber. It's just it's like what the unfiltered beer is. It's a bit darker.
Beer, yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely somewhere you got to go. And Cologne and Düsseldorf is just such a fun trip to do together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're things that we have not explored on the channel at all, really. Kolsch and Alt beer. I guess because we've never been there, and I would not even pretend to know the history and significance of those styles. So it's something we'd love to do, and we've been working on trying to get a project off the ground that would have taken there, and it hasn't quite happened yet. But they are on the list. And the third one is Colorado, because never been. I want to go to the GABF and experience one of the hotbeds of of craft in America, and that's never happened. Have you done that?
Yeah, I've done GABF. I've judged the World Great American Beer Festival a couple of times.
Right.
So then you get to attend the festival after, which is fun. But Colorado is great. It was one of the first US beer trips I did. I went up to Boulder. I went to breweries like Dale's Pale
Oscar
Ale.
Blues.
Oscar Blues, yeah, that's the one. And yeah, a bunch of oh geez, I can't remember any name of breweries at the moment. Odell's, so like classic breweries, New Belgium. Got to go to these places. This was probably 12 years ago, something like that, a long time ago. So it was one of the first big American beer trips I did. Yeah, it was so good, so cool to go and drink those beers in like where they're made.
Yeah, it feels like Colorado was incredibly significant sort of 12, 15 years ago in a way that maybe New England is now, and maybe sort of the Pacific Northwest was before Colorado. Sort of had a real moment around 2010 when it was where a lot of the great beer was being made in Scar Brewing, doing a lot of the technological advances as well. You know, like Spaten was in the 18th century, Scar coming up with like most of the canning lines, I think, in America were built by Scar in the end and stuff. So it was a big time for Colorado brewing.
Yeah, I haven't been back to Colorado for a while, actually. I'm going to Austin next week.
Oh my God.
It's not really a beer trip, but I will probably find some beer somewhere.
If you need tips, I went to Austin 2018. It's a great beer town. Some really, really good beer. And I mean, obviously the famous one of Chester King, but Austin Beer Works, and it's an amazing pizza restaurant that has great beer as well. I can't remember. And a brewery called Zilka, which when I went there, I stayed opposite. Our Airbnb was opposite Zilka. So that was the beer I drank the most. And it was really great, sort of West Coast style beers. I presume it's all hazy now because that was 2018. So maybe they were resisting hazy already and mostly making West Coast beers. But yeah, amazing place, Austin.
Nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, it's for me, it's always exciting to go back to cities. So I've been a few years ago, but I don't really remember much of it because I had such a good time. It's very interesting to go and just kind of gauge where beer is at, because I can walk into pubs over here in the UK and think, okay, right, I kind of understand what's going on. I kind of understand this mix of styles. I kind of look around and I can see what people are drinking. But to go to the US is exciting for me, just to try and figure out where the beer world is going. Like, are we all moving as one in the same direction? Are we fracturing off? Is there some regionality in around Texas? Like, what are people drinking when we're there?
When was the last time you were in the States? Have you got any insight on that in that regard now?
So I was in Boston earlier this year, but I ran the marathon, so I wasn't really drinking until afterwards. And then I had very specific tastes in what I wanted to drink. So
lager, I'd imagine, yeah.
Oh yeah, I wanted the coldest, crispest, driest lager I could possibly find. And then we went to Trillium because I wanted the juiciest beer that I could possibly have. And then we just were hanging around a few breweries, but it was interesting to see the spread of styles. And I don't know, in my head it was almost a consolidation of styles. It was, we've got a couple of great lagers, we've got this variety of IPA, and we've got a dark beer, and we've got a sour or a couple of sours. Whereas in my head, there's almost this candy shop crazy variety, almost like there's like has in so many different types of beer available all the time. But it felt like, particularly in Boston, that was a little bit tighter.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there was always that cliche that the UK was sort of 5 years was the cliche behind America, and I think definitely some trends still come across from the US, but it does feel like the UK beer scene is starting to find its own identity. Like, it might be because Brad and I sort of steeped ourselves in these things, but I feel like we followed America, I think, with a real trend towards pilsners and hellers. But then, I think green hops are really starting to kick off. And anecdotally, chatting to hop farmers, they've said that they're really struggling generally, but green hops have really started to pique the interest of modern small brewers, and that they're hoping that might convert some of them towards British hops. And then also, regional and traditional British beer styles. So the rise of Antipatch and Hobday London Porter, and of people like Cloudwater and Verdant really going quite hard into best bitters and things like this, that I don't think is happening in the States outside of a couple of breweries that are really driving it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see where beer is continually evolving too, isn't it? Like what era of beer are we in, like right now? And I don't think there's no answer.
Crisis, probably
answer.
at the moment, but I get the trends seem fairly immune to, I think, the struggles of the industry as a whole, which is, I guess, a bit of a relief in terms of keeping consumers interested.
Yeah, for sure. But on that, like, kind of as you got to the end of your book, like in the lager book, I was like, okay, well, what's next? What's the future? Like, did you have a similar thing at the end of Meaning of Beer? Was it like, well, where does beer go from here? Like, what's the next thing that it could help with?
Yeah, so actually in that last chapter, I return to Carlsberg, which is chapter 2 in the book, and I have beers with, did you meet Zoran?
Yeah.
So he set up in the lab, actually, where Emil would have been working. He set up a tasting of lots of different things that they've been doing in their sort of research and development brewery. One of them was Fonio. There's a Fonio beer, which is Garrett Oliver's been leading the charge of, and lots of breweries have started brewing with, including, I think, Guinness have just done one. And we also tasted some things. I think Zoran was trying to push this idea that beer could winify quite successfully. So they had this beer called Tears of Enzo, which was basically a wild ale brewed with this breed of barley that is, well, it looks black, the actual grains, but once you brew with it, it's bright red. Well, bright, like blush pink. It's quite an amazing color that this beer had. And it has this kind of almost, once you combine it with some wild yeast and some acidity, it has a real, I guess, kind of rosé character to it, like fresh kind of cranberry, red currant kind of flavors to it. And he was saying it was being sold in The Alchemist, which is a famous restaurant in Copenhagen, for £300 a bottle. And he was trying to sort of say to me that, this was the future of beer. He was like, we don't want to fight. Yeah, Carlsberg in particular doesn't want to fight in sort of the 1 or 2% of the market that's making hazy IPA. He was like, the craft brewers do it so well. They do it in ways that we could never justify here at Carlsberg. And so we're looking at it this way. But, I don't necessarily think that is the right approach, but that's certainly what Carlsberg thought it would be. And with Carlsberg's history, you're kind of like, well, I have to listen, because you were the future of beer for well over 100 years. But I mean, I don't know what the future of beer is from writing this book. I was kind of hoping there would be some insight, and I think definitely my editor, Alan and Unwin, was hoping there'd be some insight into the future of beer. But most of the future that I talk about is the future of yeast, and how that's, got all kinds of implications for the production of biofuels and medicines, and it already does do lots of that. But as to the future of beer, it's really murky right now, I think, because we're in a bit of a period of bust, and it doesn't feel like a lot of innovation and growth and change is really happening. And I sort of finished on a bit of a downer in the book, a little bit of a, isn't it sad that we're here in this moment, and not entirely sure where it's going. Like, it doesn't feel like a requiem at the end, but it's certainly sort of how I felt writing, that it was a bit like, look at everything we've lost and everything we haven't talked about, and maybe if people take this book on board, we'll find a brighter future. Where did you leave Brief History of Lager thinking?
I kind of want to go back. I just want to step on your point there, because I think that's really interesting. That as soon as you said that, made me think of like rose tinted glasses. Grass is greener sort of thing. Like, oh, wow, look at all these brilliant things that we've had in the past, and it feels like they're changed now and they're different.
Yeah.
And obviously they are, but I think for me, the excitement is that, there's just this incredible variety, isn't there? There's this incredible choice, and there's these brilliant stories that we can still tell through beer. I think as beer writers, that's the thing which inspires us so much, is the stories that we can tell around it. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that there's almost this sadness, like, oh, okay, well, I don't know what's next, but the excitement is that we get to figure that part out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I should say, like, I'm always super excited to tell stories about breweries and about new beers and new approaches. I guess there's a slight, because I've been buried in this book for so long, there's a little bit of like, who is making the big exciting moves right now in the brewing space, and it's all very hard to understand the changes that are happening. It's all GMO yeasts and interbreeding in arable farming and this kind of stuff that is slightly removed from, we're not going to isolate yeast again. We're not going to invent the fridge again. These things that overnight would have made us go, this sort of changes everything for brewing. We've made the really great breakthroughs, and I guess the sadness comes from, where did the really big, amazing stories come from? And I think that's why on the Craft Beer Channel, I've been really keen to work on Keep Cask Alive, because I think that the stories in cask ale are still both incredibly historically important and resonant, but also in modern terms, in terms of the importance of beer and the pub to society, it's still super relevant. And I think that's what gets me really excited about beer now. It is that, that preservation of the things that makes beer great. And preservation is quite a loaded phrase. It makes it sound like it's disappearing. I don't think cask would ever disappear, but just, I see the joy of Craft Beer Channel making people aware of these things. And I think, weirdly, I'm most excited about telling cask stories, because I guess also because there's so much diversity in beer, it's hard to know where it's going to go if you're asking about the future, which is the joy of it. But also as storytellers, it's hard to pick the really worthwhile stories, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. As a drinker, I find myself one, just more interested in alcohol free, because I think the varieties there are so good. But I'm almost making more of my choices on sort of sustainability and ingredients. So if I know that there's a brewery that is using regenerative agriculture, or is buying barley that's been grown with regenerative agriculture, then a lot of my choices are being based on that. Just because I think, we need to be making choices which can benefit the environment as well. So yeah, that to me feels like something that's fairly significant right now. But also, it's still a very minor, very small scale thing, and it's something that is of intrinsic value to me, and I feel better if I choose it. But flavor wise, it's no different. Like, it's not like it's it drinks in a completely different way, and it has these remarkable flavors because it's grown with cover crops.
Yeah, it's really tempting to try and say things like that, and you have to sort of measure yourself and go, that's not the story here. And make sure that the sustainability angle of the story is super compelling. Well, anyway, we've prattled on for nearly an hour. We've done a full Brad and gone well past what we try to make these podcasts last for. So thank you so much for all that insight in those stories. I think I couldn't have written The Meaning of Beer without to some extent without any of your books. We didn't tell the original story of how we met, but it was while you were at Camden Town Brewery, and I think I applied as a volunteer to work at some festivals, and we connected that way. And weirdly, that was sort of over lager. That was over Hell's that we, I guess, sort of met each other and connected and got excited about beer. So it's interesting that we're still talking about the same styles, just made under very different circumstances and eras.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for being on the podcast with us. Next week we'll have Brad back. I hope he might still be jet lagged. We'll see. Maybe jet lag Brad will be a lot of fun on here. I'm not sure. And of course we have our next video about how beer has changed the world, and that is with Guinness and the advertising. So hopefully I'll see lots of you tomorrow night on our live show. But otherwise we'll see you on Wednesday. Love and beer. The Bubble and Friday 5pm podcasts are brought to you by the nerds behind YouTube's Craft Beer Channel. You can watch over 400 mini documentaries at youtube.com/The Craft Beer Channel. And if you love what we do, support us via Patreon and get access to merchandise and our amazing Discord forum, a positive and welcoming space for everyone who loves beer, food, and homebrewing. Love and beer.